Okay, folks, good morning. My name is Jill Karsten. I'm a retired National Science Foundation person. My co-conveners here are Greg Jenkins from Penn State and Erica Marin-Spiata from the University of Wisconsin. We're delighted to have you here. The name of this session, I don't have it with me. Oh, Reframing the Conversation, Why Diversity in the Geosciences Workforce Matters. There's been a really rich set of sessions and talks this whole week about diversity in the geosciences. A lot of them have focused on specific effective strategies and some of the issues and barriers to participation of a variety of audiences. And in this session, what we're really trying to do is to really emphasize the research and the knowledge base that shows that actually diversity strengthens the geosciences. It's not a problem to be solved, it's actually an opportunity. And so, although some of the talks will speak more about where we're still need to do a lot more work, we're really trying to reframe that context of how we think about diversity and inclusion in the geosciences. So thank you for coming. Our first talk is going to be by Corey Garza, Pathways to Diversity and Inclusion in 21st Century Geoscience, Challenge and Opportunities.
Great, thank you everyone for attending this morning. So my talk's going to focus a little bit on some of the challenges that we've had in regards to increasing diversity in the geosciences, but some actual open opportunities that are out there for us to increase diversity and inclusion. So I'll start with the basic statistic I think many of us are familiar with, and it's showing that we're doing pretty poorly in terms of diversity in geosciences. So this was the last big survey conducted by NSF that demonstrates roughly about 8% of the graduate students that they surveyed across the geosciences identify as underrepresented. If you compare this to the biological sciences, they have a slightly higher percentage of 18%. And a lot of times my colleagues in the biological side say, oh, you guys aren't doing that badly. It's when you look at the whole numbers that you see sort of the disparity there. We have about roughly 1,300 students in the geosciences who identify as underrepresented compared to about 9,500 in the biological sciences that identify as underrepresented. So you can see we have quite a significant gap relative to other disciplines. So over the years, I've been looking at one of the causes of these, especially in the ocean sciences, which is my field here, and why we don't see a number of diverse students in our particular field. Well, one's the lack of personal connection, that you just don't sense that connection to certain areas. For example, I grew up in LA, and when I tell people that, they right away think about sort of the image of people rollerblading out on Venice Beach. LA itself is nowhere near the water. I mean, we're a good 40 to 45 minutes from the water, so it was literally out of sight, out of mind for me growing up, and so I really didn't sort of create that sort of connection until much later in life. Really unclear understanding by students about what we do. We have this tendency in the geosciences to really narrowly define what we do. I'm a microbial ecologist who studies deep sea, that doesn't really connect with people. If I tell people I'm a doctor, right away that's pretty easy for them to figure out what I do, or I'm a pharmacologist. And so we don't really sort of make it clear what it is we're doing. We're also ineffective at our messaging and engagement, particularly at early undergraduate stages. These two photos here are a prime example of that. The photo on the left is your classic oceanography graduate school brochure, a bunch of people on deck, hauling heavy gear. I went and Googled, I think in Google search term, I put down construction jobs. I pulled up the image on the right. They're almost mirror images of each other. So if you're trying to sort of engage a student who comes from sort of a working class background, they're not going to really see the difference between those two things. And then that message in and of itself conveys a lot of other sort of items there. That one, it's heavy, hard labor. Two, you have to be physically able. So if you have any type of disability, this isn't the field for you. So you're unintentionally sending a lot of different messages here. And then within sort of the underrepresented communities, we have historically overemphasized certain fields like medicine, right? And so thinking about other fields, just again, it's out of sight, out of mind. And so how do we start to sort of deal with this? Well, I think there's lots of opportunities for the geosciences to really start to engage diverse audiences. One, there actually are an overabundance of students going into the biomedical sciences. There's actually sort of really well documented hiring bottlenecks there. And so students really need to start to diversify the career paths that they're looking at, so that's a good opportunity for us. And so we can start to engage some of this with things like our messaging and the way that we engage students, and I'll talk a little about that. Thinking about skill development and helping students apply that across different types of career pathways. And then also thinking about leadership development within our own field and how we help to retain students that we try to bring into the geosciences. So the first topic I want to talk about is a way that we can start to think about engaging students. So I've been heavily involved with SACNA. Some of you might be familiar with this organization. It stands for Society for Advancement of Chicanos and Native Americans in Science. It's the largest and oldest STEM society in the U.S. focused on engaging underrepresented students in STEM, and I just happen to be on their board of directors as well. But it's a really good conference there. So about 14 years ago, I was sort of tasked with helping set up an ocean science presence there. And I thought, wow, this is going to be a real easy sell. When I went, and we were in sort of Austin, Texas. And I think we were literally in the furthest, darkest corner of the Austin Convention Center there. And we had about 15 students show up out of an attendee list of about 4,000. So it didn't go as well as I thought, but really when we sort of dug into it, we learned some lessons. One, we didn't advertise well. We were being overwhelmed by sort of the biomedical opportunities. Again, students didn't really understand what we were doing. They viewed us as a soft science. They were shocked that we had people up on stage talking about using genomics and computer modeling. I'm a spatial statistician. They're like, you guys use that? I thought you guys just sat on the beach. So students had a really different view of what we did. We weren't well coordinated. There was a real large group of ocean scientists. We were just off doing our own things. We were kind of lone wolfing it, for lack of a better term, and so we needed better coordination. And even some of the senior scientists at SOCNAS didn't understand what we did. For the better part of the first 10 years when I went there, people would ask me how my dolphin research was going. I'm a benthic ecologist, uses like GIS and seafloor mapping approaches, so I've never worked with anything charismatic in my life. So there was a lot of work, and so we addressed a lot of that. So now we have a really well-coordinated sort of presence there. We have a row of booths there in the Geosciences where students can go and learn about opportunities. We have a really well-coordinated student poster session that Sea Grant helps to support. We have Ocean Science Talk. That's Catalina Martinez there. She's talking about her work with the Okeanos there. So we actually are able to have scientific research talks and professional development sessions. And we have a well-coordinated group of judges there who can help our students provide feedback. And it's actually been a really good program for us. And so we now at this point in time, we're actually a well-established presence within SOCNAS and the students there. Now, building off of that, we recently received funding from NSF to create the equivalent of something like, some of you might be familiar with the ASLA Multicultural Program or the MS PhD program that's been previously housed in AGU. So we've been sort of funded to create the equivalent of that within SOCNAS, and so this is actually going to be the next step here in that we'll be drawing from the Geoscience RU programs to help to sort of increase student diversity in the geosciences within SOCNAS there. And so it'll be a sort of a large mentoring type program, and so this is sort of the next step in what we're doing within a conference-based approach to help increase diversity in the geosciences. The next step is really thinking about getting students involved in diverse research activities. You can get them engaged at a conference, but you have to keep that momentum going. And so one of the things I developed about 6 years ago was an REU program out of Monterey Bay. So it turned out there had never been an NSF Ocean Science REU in Monterey Bay. And so I sort of proposed setting one up. The challenge we had is I was the only person on our campus who had ever had NSF funding. We only had 4 faculty members, so that was going to be a real tough sell. So what we did is I said, well, we've got all these really cool institutions within about a 10-minute drive of campus. What if we create a partnership? And I was able to pitch that and sell it to the local Monterey community and NSF. So we have a distributed REU model where it's our campus, Elkhorn Slough, Hopkins Marine Station, Mbari, Mossman Marine Labs, and the Naval Postgraduate School. Because we have this type of distributed network in Monterey Bay, we're able to offer these different types of themes here: general marine biology and ecology, marine geology. We have an ocean engineering theme. I think it's our campus, Woods Hole and Scripps are the only REUs that offer ocean engineering. And then we have a large oceanography presence that also has a coastal meteorology component that's actually really popular with students. I was shocked that became so popular. We've done really well. We just finished our 5th year. We've had 58 students in the program. You can see the breakdown of students that we have there. We have a large Hispanic Chicano population that comes into our program. We're actually really popular in the Pacific Islands with Guam. We get a lot of applications from Guam. So for some reason, we're getting hit pretty hard with applications from Guam, so we have a pretty good presence there. We've had about 63% URM in our program over the year. I was told I'd be lucky to get 25% when I did this. So we're doing very well relative to other ones. And we've also had 11 community college students over this time. And you can see sort of the general breakdown that we have there. It tends to be heavy towards the marine bio and ecology, but we're still doing pretty well in the engineering and oceanography components. And this just want to highlight a couple of students who we've had go through the program. This is Daniel DeLeon. He was actually a community college student from Cabrillo. We placed him at Mbari. He didn't know he could use engineering outside of IT support, computer engineering outside of that. So he worked to develop a software package for Mbari to help them identify different species of whale based on sort of different frequencies in their call there. He presented actually a poster at SOCNAS and got discovered by Google. Now he's part of a large marketing campaign that they have showing how different people use their software to sort of understand the world. And so he's on this large Google sort of marketing scheme right now. He recently transferred, got his AA at Cabrillo College. Now he's in the engineering program at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and he's actually doing a joint marine biology engineering degree over there. This is Paris. This is actually one of my favorite stories here. So he came to us from University of South Carolina and worked again at Mbari with Charlie Paul, who's one of their geologists. He was very open about his background. He came from a neighborhood where it wasn't considered a good thing to show you were smart. He was kind of taking care of his little brother. He had actually gotten kicked out of South Carolina and had to go back to community college and reapply. So he had one of those sort of red flag type of applications, but we said, this guy looks like he's got some potential. He's been participating, went through our program, actually came here to the MS PhD program, got motivated to apply to Woods Hole. I was like, that's going to be a pretty heavy lift, or we'll see what we can do. Well, he got in. He was the first African-American to get into their program in 6 years, and the next year he got an NSF GRFP, and apparently he's like a grant-producing machine there right now. So he's an example of what happens when you take a chance on a talent source you might not normally take a chance on. And then finally, starting to think about sort of leadership and sort of how we do that. And so this is a program we just spun up, another NSF program out of the NSF Gold Program, where we're looking at place-based science as a way to bridge traditional geoscience research with the needs of underserved communities. And so we use this graph here as an example. So if you look on that lower left quadrant, that's how we might normally sort of conceptually think about applied science, is that you come from a place of concern and you go towards some solution sort of based approach here. And that's also the space where you're going to tend to work with a lot of underserved, underrepresented groups. Traditional sort of geoscience from an NSF perspective research might be like, hey, how does that thing work? And you go towards this kind of basic discovery research, but you don't necessarily have a solution there. What we're doing is we're using Aspire as a way to bridge sort of the community-based science with sort of traditional geoscience. And we're using working group approaches here, where we have an individual, where we actually fund RFPs in this, we fund proposals here, where we have this person known as a boundary spanner, someone who has experience in this case in the world of geoscience, but also working communities leading this group. And one of the things about our proposal process here is you have to have at least 2 community members as part of the research team. It can't just be all academics doing this, because we want sort of a true sort of collaboration here. And the idea is we also sort of doing some modeling is, what is it about this boundary spanner that makes them so successful, and how can we model that into leadership development training that we can then start to push around the geoscience sort of community here to try to create a new generation of these boundary spanners. We see a lot of wells here. One, there's this broadening participation component. We see this as a way of broadening the type of people who get involved in geosciences. We see this, again, as kind of discovering new types of leadership within the geosciences and actually really sort of developing that and helping that sort of percolate across the geosciences. And then more broadly within the geosciences, there's a potential to really reframe and rebrand the geosciences as societally relevant. And we can see just one example here, one of our Aspire case studies in Samita Farms in Hawaii. So this is our boundary spanner here is Jennifer Engels, who works with Hawaii Extension here, and she's working with local farms there. They're native Hawaiian farms where historically they've used sort of freshwater aquifers to grow things like watercress, were an important crop historically in Hawaii. They're running into issues of saltwater intrusion now because of the overdrawing of groundwater. So what they're doing is they're blending traditional Hawaiian approaches with modern geoscience sort of techniques to try to come up with novel solutions to this approach, this case, and it's been working really well so far. And they're actually using really cool methods like ArcMap Storyteller here to actually tell the story of their communities across really sort of large expanses here. And so it's been one of our more successful projects. And so this really gets me to the end point here, of my talk here. Like, why are we worried about diversifying the geosciences? And I like this story here because I think it really exemplifies what happens when you bring in new talent. So I grew up in LA, so I'm a Dodgers fan, and yes, the World Series is still a little sore for me. But, the one person you hear most about when you're growing up is Jackie Robinson. And so his story is pretty well known. He was the first African American to play in baseball, and his inclusion in baseball brought about a lot of social change. What people forget to talk about with him, he was also an incredible baseball player. He's a Hall of Fame second baseman and the first rookie of the year in baseball. And the way that he played the game was vastly different than the way other people were playing the game at the time. So where people were sort of thinking is that he's going to have to adapt to the game in order to fit in. In fact, the game had to adapt to him. And in fact, the way most modern baseball teams are structured are based off of the talent sets that Jackie Robinson bought. But on the other side of the story, you also have to have people in sort of positions of power who are willing to take a chance on that talent. And that's Brent Rickey on the right there. So he was the general manager of the Dodgers, and he's the person that brought Jackie in. So I'll be wrapping up here really soon. And so what he did is he saw sort of that Jackie had a certain talent there, one that was going to give him an advantage of other teams, because anything that Branch hated, it was losing to the Yankees and Giants every year. So he took a chance on Jackie, brought him in, knocked down some doors for him, and eventually they made the Dodgers a dominant force for the better part of the decade, and they ultimately won the World Series in 1955. As a result of that partnership, you now see most teams are highly diverse collections of individuals, and if you don't have diverse teams there, you're not going to win the World Series. And that's kind of the big lesson that we can take away from baseball as a geoscience community. So just in closing here, summary, so increasing diversity in the geosciences, it's really going to require a community to really develop innovative outreach approaches here. You have to have messaging that really sort of resonates with the cultural values of diverse student communities, such as things that service the community. You have to start engaging students in the first and second year. Getting to them by the time they're juniors and seniors is sometimes too late. You really have to start to emphasize the development of technical skills and how they apply that across a broad array of different career pathways. And finally, we have to start developing communication and leadership skills, both at the early career scientists and above, to really help us sort of improve our engagement with diverse populations. And thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. We're going to hold off on questions until the end. We have a little bit of time for a panel discussion. So our next presenter is the paper is Equality of Opportunities Initiatives Underway in the European Research Council and the European Geosciences Union Communities. This is Claudia Jesus Rodin and Alberto Montanari are going to tag team on this. Thank you. Good.
So I will talk about the initiatives and the way at the European Research Council, the ERC. So the European Research Council was funded just a little bit over 10 years, and it's the only funding body in Europe that it's designed and it's governed by scientists, for scientists. Here you have a picture of our scientific council, and what you have is high-level scientists that represent various fields of disciplines. You can see there one that probably some of you are familiar with, that is representing the geosciences, which is Barbara Romanovich. So the ERC has mainly three schemes of grants. There is the starting grant, the consolidated grant, and advanced grant. The starting grant, we have what we call an eligibility window, which is 2 to 7 years after PhD, and the consolidator is 7 to 12 years after PhD. However, since the early stages of the ERC, already in the first call that we had in 2007, we identified certain conditions in which we should grant an extension of this eligibility window. So in 2007, we agreed that we were going to give to women candidates per child after PhD a possibility to extend this window by 12 months. Of course, but very quickly we realized that it made no sense that the child had to be born after the PhD because the impact in the career comes at any time. So in 2010, we made some adjustments and we enlarged from 12 months to 18 months, and it didn't matter whether the child was born before or after the PhD. In 2013, we removed from our template of application for the grant, something that we call the scientific leadership potential, because it was a self-evaluation part of the proposal, and we could really identify that there was a lot of imbalances that were brought in by this section on how men and women self-evaluated themselves. In 2016, we started to show a video on unconscious bias to all our panel members. And in 2017, we put in our, what we call our work program, which is the guideline for the application, that equal opportunities or gender balance were now an eligible cost within the grant. It already existed before, but it was written in the contract. And we thought it was, of course, much more useful that this is stated upfront in the work program while you're preparing the grant, so that you can take the costs into consideration while you're designing your program, your research program. In 2018, we just did a training, a pilot training to our program officers, so people like me that coordinate one of the research areas. And now it's just been decided that not only we're going to extend to all the program officers, but also to the management, and more importantly, to our scientific council, so our governing body. And this is extremely important because they play a very important role, of course, in our organization, but they are really hands-on in recruiting panel members that sit in our evaluation panel. So having them train on unconscious bias is, of course, a very important step. Now here I have some data for the 3 grant schemes. So the first one, starting grant on the top, and then consolidator and advanced. What you see in black is the submission, the percentage of women submitting proposals. In orange is the success rate by women, and in green, success rate by men. So what you can see in starting grant, this is just for the Earth System Sciences. What you can see in starting grant is that women are quite often having a higher success rate than men. In consolidated grant, you see there is some fluctuation, but it's pretty comparable. In advanced grant, it's more difficult to make a very robust analysis because we only have 10% of women submitting, so the numbers are really low. But what I want, the message I want to show to say with this is that there is no evidence that women are less successful and that they are giving up, because in the last call, in all the grant schemes, starting grant, consolidated grant, and advanced grant, actually there was an increase in the absolute numbers of women submitting proposals. Now, because it appears that this message that I've just mentioned is very positive for women, so now I feel the need for the last year to also make this statement that we do not do positive discrimination. There is no affirmative actions at the ERC, and there is no quotas. So everybody that received an ERC grant was worthy of receiving it. So every woman that got it was not because they were women, was because they were worthy of getting this grant, just to make things clear. So about the future, we hope that more women will be applying, especially in advanced grant. I know that this is a reflection of the proportion of women in the more senior track record in the geosciences, but we really hope to see a broader pool of women applying to the advanced grant. And we hope to maintain diversity in our panels. Surprisingly or not, we have a higher acceptance rate when men are invited to serve in our committees, in our evaluation committees, than women. I know women are overloaded, but we really hope that more women will accept when we invite them to serve in the ERC panel. I think it's a very important experience to sit in this panel. And we also hope to continue the dialogue that we have initiated for many years with the scientific societies, such as the one we have initiated for several years with EGU and also with AGU. So I will pass now to Alberto. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. I am jumping in as the president-elect of EGU. It's the main scientific association focusing on geosciences in Europe. And I'm pleased to report our experience, the results of our experience seeking diversity and equality. We recognized gender balance as a relevant feature already almost 10 years ago, when we had some discussion with the community pointing out that we needed to take it very seriously. And we had articulated discussion recently on the way we should address it, because of course, as we all know, it's a delicate issue. We didn't want to introduce any positive bias, but we wanted to make sure that we realized whether unconscious bias was there, and we wanted to devise a strategy to avoid unconscious bias and to remove it if we realized that there was a need to move forward in that sense. And we agreed that we should adopt a bottom-up discussion in order to face the problem. EGU is adopting, in general, a bottom-up approach with deep consultation with the community, with the grassroots of our scientists. It's not easy, and sometimes it makes the discussion even more complicated than adopting a top-down approach. But we wanted to move forward in that way, and we recognize the need to make a quantitative assessment of facts through data analysis. And therefore, also, we decided that diversity and equality should include not only gender balance, and this is something that today is widely accepted, but at that time, I can tell you, about 10 years ago, it was something that had to be discussed a lot, because it's even more difficult to resolve other kinds of imbalance, like, for instance, the geographical balance. And in Europe, even within Europe, if we look at the geographical balance, we have some disparities. And in particular, there is the south of Europe that is dominated by non-native English speakers that claimed that we should also look at that kind of diversity. In several of our procedures, including awards, including assignment of oral talks, etc. So we, first of all, recognize the need for collecting data, and from 2014, data were collected on nomination and awards. And again, this is something that today is widely accepted, but I can tell you that introducing the concept was not so easy, because there is a general convincement that in the award selection procedures, confidentiality must be ensured. And therefore, some people were reluctant to collect data and to make the data public. I think it has been a significant advance that it's now widely accepted that we have to know the data. We have to know the problem, to quantify the problem. So we adopted a discrete approach, and we wanted to take a positive attitude. As Jill said, this is an opportunity. It shouldn't be seen as a problem. It's indeed an opportunity, diversity, and also I appreciated what the first speaker said. It's indeed an opportunity to increase the power of the community. So we organized sessions starting from 2016, like this one, focusing on this opportunity and trying to stimulate a discussion. And finally, a couple of months ago, the EGU Council decided to create a working group focusing on diversity and equality. And the task of the working group is to propose strategies and actions. I'm pleased to show you some data now. And first, if you look at the pie chart on the left, you see statistics, and also on the chart in the middle, you see statistics on our membership. We have a percentage of female member today that is about 32%. And of course, if you look at the percentages in the different age classes, there are differences, there is diversity. And if you look at life and honorary members, we have a dominance of men. And also regular members, women are 28%. If we look at students, women are 40%. These are statistics related to gender balance only. If we look at our medals since 2014, if you look at the union medals, they were all awarded to men, and keep in mind that the average age is around 70. So this explains one of the main reasons of the problem. If we look at division medals, we have a percentage of women that is equal to 18%. If we look at the outstanding early career awards on the right, you see that the percentage of women is 24%. This was up to last year, up to 2000 this year, up to 2018. I show you later the statistics for 2019. So if we look at the total statistics, we received in terms of nominations in 5 years, from 2014 to 2018, a total of about 800 nominations, and the percentage of female was 20%. If we look at the awardees, the percentage of females is 19%. So basically what we realized is that there is almost a coincidence between the percentage of women nominated and the percentage of women awarded. So we realized the first conclusion was that we should work on the nomination process, not only on the selection process, but we should start from the nomination process. And this was one of the first actions that we decided to take. Now, this is a slide summarizing our strategy. First of all, and I think this is a relevant feature of the EGU selection process, awards and medals in EGU are approved by Council. The selection committee only forward to council nominations, and then council looks at the big picture and tries to assess whether there are biases that need to be resolved. In particular, for the early career scientists, we don't have a selection committee. It's council that makes the selection and tries to make sure that there is balance. We are now starting, hopefully from the next year, to train EGU officers on unconscious bias, because we realize that this is maybe really the real problem. And we are considering, and we are starting in 2019, to rename medals and awards by eventually considering naming them after two scientists, one man and one woman. And we are starting with the first medal in the spring season. And we support events focusing on diversity and equality, and we try to make sure that we have balanced nominations. And we are also devising a strategy to look at the geographical balance and try to resolve it. Keep in mind, I believe this is really possible, so to adopt excellence as the main criteria, but at the same time devise review procedures that try to minimize bias, it's certainly possible. It depends on the type of bias that you're looking for, and if we look at awards, for instance, I go back to my first remark here, we think that a selection that is based on looking at the big picture is important. I'm closing with some statistics for the EGU Awards 2019. These are to be awarded in April. We got 177 nominations, and 31% of them nominated female scientists. So indeed, you see that we succeeded in increasing the percentage of women nominated, and 35% of this year awardees are females. If we look at our Outstanding Young Scientist, Early Career Scientist Awards, we awarded 4, 3 of them are women. So we know that from one single point we cannot draw statistics, but it seems that we are moving forward to a better direction. Thank you. Sorry if I took a little bit longer.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alberto and Claudia. Got to do a little technology change here.
Oops. How do we get it? It's not right. Oh, because it's mirrored.
Meteorology.
Okay.
But hopefully going to be
Okay.
geography department.
Okay.
All right, our next presenter is Janet Vertisi, Beyond Bias, Proportionality, and Network Effects in Scientific Collaboration.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thanks for being here. I appreciate the invitation. So I'm a sociologist of science. I'm at Princeton University, and I've been studying planetary scientists who are a member of this community for over a decade. And of course, like many of the members in this room, we've discovered a problem in planetary science where women and minorities are desperately underrepresented within the workforce. And recent studies of this have placed women's participation at a little over 20% in the community, about 24 or so. And I've also noticed that major significant differences between the racial makeup of the community and the racial makeup of the American population at large. So even if intelligence and hard work were randomly distributed in a population, you would still get better numbers than this, right? Which indicates that there are some significant problems in the way of producing a meritocratic environment. We also know that this is actually a problem for science more broadly, because sociological studies of diversity on teams have indicated an important role for diversity in producing high-impact science as well as innovative science. And when we look at diverse teams that represent interdisciplinary diversity, personal and identity diversity, diversity of networks, they consistently produce higher impact scientific papers, and they also produce higher impact and more innovative technical product as well. So to address this question, of course, there's been a lot of interest in implicit bias, unconscious bias, and a lot of interest in addressing those issues at that level of the community. What I wanted to introduce today are a couple of concepts from the sociological way of looking at this problem to give you a little more ammunition and tractability on the problem and some of the issues that you're seeing more generally. And the sociological explanation gets away from what's happening in the single individual biased human's head and instead looks at the kinds of things that happen in populations or groups that produce certain kinds of exclusive behaviors. So what I'm going to talk about today, there's of course a wide range of literature on this, but I'm going to talk about two issues in particular, the proportionality and network effects. And I'm going to focus on these because they not only describe some of the situations that we're seeing and some of the outcomes that we're seeing, but they also suggest practical implications and interventions for change. So on the proportionality question, I want you to remember this graph here of just women being at a little over 20% of the population. Okay, so what's essential here is classic work by Rosa Beth Kanter at Harvard University on the proportionality of different groups. And her theory is that as proportions of groups change, so do social experiences, not just for the minorities or individuals in the groups, but also for the group more generally. And there are key patterns that persist at different levels of representation in a population. So if you have 0% minorities or just a very small group of minorities, a small fraction of minorities, they're not going to diversify the group at all. They're just going to behave like the majority group. Similarly, if you're at 50-50, the issues of majority and minority fall away. And you can just focus on the science. You can just focus on the issues. The key moments happen at 15% and at 30%. So as minorities hover around or under 15%, you end up what she calls a uniform group, a skewed group. And this produces what she calls tokenist dynamics. I'll describe this in a minute. So at around 15%, you're at high risk for tokenism. And then between 15 and 30%, things get better at 30%. You can actually just focus on the science. But between 15 and 30, the group will reap some of the benefits of diversity, but there will be huge backlash effects against that minority group. So remember 15 and remember 30, and this is where we get the notion of the 30% rule, that if you have a 30% makeup at least of a minority population, you're at least getting closer to this balanced group situation where you can just focus on the issues. So what is tokenism? Tokenism has a bit of a bad rap, because when we think about tokenism, we think, oh, well, that's the notion of you're just here because you're a woman, or you just got this job because you're African American. I actually want you to pay attention to the moments when that happens, because those are sociological indicators that tokenism is occurring, that you are in a skewed group. Those are not the cause of tokenism, that's the effect of tokenism, is the group thinking the only reason why this person is here is because of this other status situation. So when you're in a situation of tokenism in a skewed group, that individual, that token, is put in an almost impossible situation that ends up torquing the entirety of the scientific collaboration. I have seen this repeatedly. In fact, if there, sociologists see this repeatedly, but I've seen this repeatedly in planetary. So on the one hand, you have the fact that that token, and I should just note really quickly, this is an image from Rosa Beth Kanter's materials on this. And this is the idea that, like, if there's a whole bunch of X's and one O, what do you focus on? You focus on the O, right? So that O, or that token individual, has the negative effects of visibility associated with them. They are put into heightened positions of visibility. They are always trotted out as, oh, look, we have women. Oh, look, we have minorities here. And in that case, they're not only put in a position where they're subject to these external situations, but they're also retaliated against by the larger majority group because they get so much visibility, because they get so much status. And so they're informally isolated, and they're frequently tested for their loyalty. We also notice that those individuals, because they're the only O in the room, are the ones that are being asked to stand in as a stereotype for all individuals' behaviors and to account for all individuals' behaviors as part of that group. I should also note that in many cases, people in this kind of minority position, about 15%, are put into positions that we call structural powerlessness. That means they have all the responsibility but no authority. And this frequently takes place maybe because we're testing them, we're sort of putting them in a sort of transitional position, we're trying to see how well they do, but we don't really give them the reins to move forward. What we see for individuals, but especially for minorities put in those positions, is that this leads to micromanagement, accusations of micromanagement, lashing out, territorialism, and also they're the kind of people that don't support their subordinates. How many times have you heard that? I don't understand. She's such a powerful woman in science. Why doesn't she support the young women under her, right? So this is the kind of situation that happens in skewed groups, and because this happens, there's very negative effects not only for those individuals' reputations in scientific fields, but also for the way that the community has to work and work around that. So I'll note that here is an example of a skewed team that I studied, in which there was a senior woman, or there's a woman appointed to a very senior executive role, but she was the only one on this very small executive committee. So definitely under the 15% mark. And this is how she described it. My job is to present my team's case. I feel like I'm not being listened to, so I get louder. And pretty soon everyone's looking at me going, what a bitch. And so meanwhile, I want to say, I'm sorry, you made me this way. I have to act this way just to make you pay attention to me. You develop a reputation. And this is a quote from her manager, who I interviewed a few years later. I haven't spent much time trying to understand the why of her behavior. It's all speculative. You can't do much about it. You just try to work with her as best you can. In her case, you have to overpower her by one device or another before she'll pay attention. And another scientist I interviewed described her as the most self-aggrandizing, self-important person I've ever met. So these kinds of reputational accretions belong to these individuals and stick with them throughout their career. And this individual moved from a powerful position at a strong university to weaker and weaker positions and has had difficulty maintaining that status in the community. Now I'll note that this is what happens at 15%, but remember what happens between 15 and 30% is that backlash from the majority group. So here are some examples of numbers from mission teams. These are the large scientific collaborations that the NASA funds within your community. And you'll note that the top of the graph is 30%, right? That's the top. That's that axis, is 30%. We're not even there. And starting in the 1990s, you start to get these teams that are hovering exactly around that tokenism mark at 15%. And increasingly, we're getting a little bit closer, but at that 20-25% mark, you are still going to be dealing with backlash dynamics associated with those individuals. And here's an example of, this is numbers from, I think it's 2007, and you'll look at the bottom as Earth Sciences. So you're, again, 10% for full professorship of women in Earth Sciences, under 30% in the assistant. So you're still hovering in that tokenist and backlash environment for both of those communities. So what's the response to this? Should you come in and do the affirmative action quota thing? Like what should we do? In many cases, that has been the response to Rosa Kanter's work, but there's other ways to counter this, and you can do this by understanding how social networks work, especially how networks work among minority groups. And I'll note here that a lot of the literature that studies women in these kinds of teams, that we've found that also applies to other minorities as well, people of color and other sexual and identity minorities. So a brief primer on social networks, that this is the kind of thing that sociologists study. It's a rich field of inquiry. And this isn't just like who do you collaborate with, who do you know, and who are you sending Facebook messages to. This has to do with a measurement of social capital. And by measurement of social capital, what we mean is how densely interconnected are you to other individuals, and then how weakly connected are you to other individuals who might bring you outside sources of information. So key elements in social networks are understanding the mechanisms such as homophily, which is the whole birds of a feather flock together notion that groups like to be relatively homogenous. Also that we know there's a difference between strong ties, the people you work with all the time, and the weaker ties, the people that you just kind of know peripherally, as sources of information for your group. And that depending on how strongly or weakly interconnected you are as a social network, you have access to more or less information. So social capital is not actually a measurement of how skillful or how powerful or wonderful you are. It's a measurement of how socially connected you are, both with those strong ties and with weaker brokerage ties to other kinds of communities. And we know now from studies of innovation and high impact that these bridges between social networks, those weak ties, are the primary key sources of innovative information, and those are the locus, that's the locus of innovation and of innovative overlap. So that's like the disciplinary bridge between different groups where you start to see really high impact science. But we also know that when networks become increasingly closed, then they're more open to risk because they don't have the information coming from elsewhere that might give them not only more innovative ideas, but also able to respond to the environment in a different way. Now, interestingly, the people that have studied organizations, studied social capital, started to notice that if you controlled for gender, you see really different kinds of dynamics. So on the one hand, we note that there can be very strong local pockets of women's networks in the sciences and in organizations. And those provide local advantages to their members, but they don't provide social capital more broadly. They're not bridges to other groups in and of themselves. And especially when those networks are closed, they don't have access to the opportunities or information that they need. Now, social capital can be quote-unquote borrowed if women in those networks have relationships, mentorship relationships to powerful men in other networks. And that allows you to have an information conduit to that local women's network. And we call this the work uncle situation, someone that's watching out for that individual and taking care of them and fostering and mentoring them through. Now, this is the reason why when you have diverse networks and lots of loose interconnections, minority careers can actually do very well. But if they're very, very strong, like tight social groups that do not have a lot of brokerage between them, women and other minorities do not do as well, and they kind of flounder, they don't have the same access to information. I'll note that this also happens to young men, but as they get older, the disadvantages get made up. So here's a sort of success story, and I did blot some of these slides out a bit, not only for individualizing information, but also because we had to give the slides to the AGU. I wasn't sure where those were going. But here's an example of what was happily called on this team the Old Girls Network. And what happened here is there were a bunch of women who were employed in the deputy roles to the series of men who set up this collaboration. But those women knew each other from a prior scientific collaboration, so they had a lot of trust and friendship networks already established. They started to invite other young women to join in that network, and they sort of grew and expanded that network. But at the same time, they had very strong mentorship relationships, and they had very strong work uncles in place that sort of shield them from any effect of tokenism in the workplace. So as they had these other competent newcomers come in, the network grew. And as the men moved up and moved on in their careers, those women moved up. So by the time I studied this collaboration, it was women in almost all of the senior roles. This is an image of the chief scientist, her deputy, and then their assistant as well. And the chief engineer was also a scientist, and so on and so forth. So there was also a woman. So this was a really great success story for women in this collaboration because they had so much, not only visibility, but they had so much support, and they were well over the 30% mark. Now, what gets complicated here is that within these networks, because we use these networks to judge based on merit, and this can provide one of the big fallbacks associated with with having closed networks. So it turns out that the more informal are the rules for advancement, the more people rely on social capital, reputation, and relationships in order to adjudicate quote-unquote merit. This is because people are using reputation, similarity, and the homogeneity of the network in order to adjudicate fit, how well this person looks like a scientist, how well they're performing as a scientist, do I know them, etc. This is a huge problem in a field like science, which is supposedly based on merit, right? So the picture from the top right is from Emmanuel Castilla and his colleagues at MIT, who studied organizations that determine advancement through merit alone. And you'll note that on the left, there's a non-meritocratic condition where you're just supposed to give people bonuses based on their performance. And on the right is the meritocratic condition where you're supposed to give people bonuses based on their performance. And you'll note that the men outperform women every time, despite the fact that the indicators are exactly the same. So we see increased disparity, actually, the more you associate the advancement with merit. And this is, again, because people are relying on those network ties. And what this does, ultimately, is create more and more homogeneous networks. The image at the top, or the bottom left, or bottom right, my apologies, is by Gina Neff, who studied the .com bust in New York City. And this is the closed network of all of those, pets.com, et cetera, those communities that were not having any access to other information, that were relatively homogeneous. And when the network crashed, they all went down. And so this is a very powerful way to reinforce networks and to not diversify them and not create those bridging and overlapping conditions that lead to innovation. So here's an example from one of the missions that I studied where they had these very clustered groups associated with different disciplines and instruments, and NASA opened a call for participating scientists that they hope would reach across these groups and create bridging opportunities. But there were very few mechanisms for moving up on this mission. So all of the early career scientists rushed at the opportunity to have put in an application and be part of this opportunity. And at the same time, the PIs wanted to maintain autonomy over their local groups, and so they argued to NASA that there shouldn't be an independent panel of experts, that they should be the ones to evaluate the proposals. Year after year, 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10 individuals who were selected for these groups were already known to the community. They were already junior scientists working within that collaboration. So this was a very important way for them to move up, but it did not produce the kind of bridges that were necessary to diversify the team or to produce interdisciplinary insights. Yeah. So it's important to move to that innovative and impactful level of diversity, and I think you can use these dynamics to your advantage. On the one hand, aiming for the 30% rule across all levels of your organization, not just the secretaries, not just the grad students, leads to tremendous amounts of payoff in the long term. And you can do that by drawing on these weak ties, moving 1 or 2 network hops away to get information and to figure out who else is out there in these other distinct networks. You can avoid the paradox of meritocracy by setting very clear and objective and distinct criteria for inclusion. Fostering minority networks is essential because it actually produces the opportunity for these people to succeed. Giving them clear roles and responsibilities is important to avoid structural powerlessness, but also provide very clear mentorship opportunities so those people are protected from accusations of tokenism. And ultimately, collecting demographic information will help you track how well your different interventions are occurring at different times. So thank you very much. I appreciate your...
Thank you. Just a reminder that we're going to be holding questions till the discussion at the very end of this session. All right, our next presentation is Gender Inequalities, Horizontal Policy Making Wanted by Connolly and Stadmark, and Daniel Connolly is going to present.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation to come and talk. I want to talk about gender inequalities, but what I really want to do is at the end talk about the way forward and some of the things we can do to reduce these differences. We have heard a lot about gender equalities, both on Tuesday, we're hearing about it today. There are some really well-known things, including pay inequalities and promotion. And a lot of these arise from implicit bias and how people's perceptions of different people are. And it varies by location, of course, and it can be partly due to cultural norms. So you can have differences between departments that are next to each other, our institutions, our states, our countries, and you can see large differences between groups and how they deal with these things. There are also large differences in social policies, especially as you go on the broader international scale. Things like healthcare, maternal and paternal leave, access to affordable daycare, and flexible work schedules. Those are some of the things that are often mentioned by people for one of the reasons for gender inequalities. And of course, they vary by country and also by social norms as well. This paper, this report from Marian Holmes suggested that it was actually affordable daycare and flexible work and arrangements that were extremely important to overcome this bias and create a more gender balance. In Europe, we have a very different situation. So we decided to take a look about conditions in Europe. In France and also in Scandinavia, where I am, the countries Denmark, Norway, Sweden, not Switzerland, Sweden. And the government is committed to a variety of different initiatives. We have daycare, we have paid parental leave, we have sick leave, we have long vacation terms. We have less time options, especially for families when they have young kids, and flexible work schedules, and of course, excellent health care. And all of these things should lead to not differences in gender. But unfortunately, we still have the same differences in gender that are experienced in many other countries. So one of the things we wanted to do was to look at data and look for gender imbalances. And we were more interested in looking at research funding and seeing what kind of imbalances might occur in research funding. And we used the European Research Council. The talk, a couple ones before by Claudia, talked about this. And there are, I just want to point out briefly, there's 3 levels. There's starting grants, consolidator, and advanced grants, and they're for different ages of your career. And we're going to focus on the physical sciences and engineering because that's where the Earth system sciences is pulled in. We need to pool the data in order to make it more robust. And so we looked at success rates across a variety of, across the physical sciences and engineering. And there's actually 3 different numbers in here. The first 2 are success rates between men and women. The green is the percent of female submissions, and the numbers are how many applications we're dealing with. If we look at the overall, the success rate between men and women are pretty much equal. If we go to a country like France, they actually have much higher success rates overall than many other countries, and it turns out that women have higher success rates than men. In Scandinavia, we see their overall success rates to be closer to the overall mean, but women have a lower success rate. But there are fewer number of applications to really estimate this. If we look across the different panels from starting grants to consolidators to advanced grants, again, that's different levels of career. We'll focus on the green that you can't see so well here. But one of the interesting things is you see the classic leaky pipeline. You see that there's more applications from starting grants from women, and it goes down, especially in the advanced grants when you get to more senior established people. We started to compare across different science foundations. And surprisingly, it's hard to find numbers for different science foundations. This is a fantastic report from the General Accounting Office that went through all the different funding agencies for research in the United States. And one of the things they found is that there were three groups, the National Institute of Health, the National Science Foundation, and USDA, that all basically had equal success rates between men and women. For the Department of Defense and Department of Energy and NASA, it was more of a mixed bag. If you read the report carefully, there were some programs that had more men than women. Some programs had more women funded than men. But overall, there wasn't enough statistics to really analyze it on a large basis. And at least from what I've seen on other reports, including the Natural Environmental Research Council in the UK and Canada, the success rates between men and women are pretty much equivalent. And I think this is really good news to see. But we can't really evaluate it across all different science foundations because a lot of them don't necessarily publish their numbers. But there's one thing that I really want to point out here that is very disturbing when you get to it. And we focus on the green line, which is the percentage of female submissions. And you can see overall, the rate of submissions are 17%. And I want to ask, how come women are not applying for research grants? And you might say this is for the European Research Council, it's for physical science and engineering, and there's less women in there. But there's actually reports from the National Environmental Research Council in the UK that also shows that only 23% of women are applying for grants. And I don't know why this is happening. I think this is an extremely important thing to look into. At the European Research Council, it's talked a lot about its elite funding. And there are discussions that women don't like elite funding. They'd rather work in a team or not be a leader. There's other people that talk about competition. And I don't know what the reasons are, but I think it's something that we need to look into, because if you start to compare the number of people in the field to the number of people applying for grants, we see a very different picture. So the way forward, I have a number of things I want to talk about. And the first is this thing with unconscious bias training that Claudia talked about that they do at the European Research Council. It turns out that most major national science foundations have implicit bias training that all panel members have to go through before they start to discuss the proposals. And they realize that they are taught to realize that it's an important thing that we have to look at. But implicit bias is not just about gender and science foundations. It could be whether you're from a major university or a small university, or your field. Some fields are considered more sexy than other fields. And so having this kind of unbiased conscious training helps people to recognize these differences. This question about is there bias in funding, I've looked at other reports from other agencies, and it's really hard to find whether or not there are differences in the number of women applying for grants. We know that the success rates are relatively similar, and that's really good. And so what we're recommending is that there are studies be undertaken to shed light on why there's this big differences between the number of men and women applying. And the second part of this is about horizontal policies. And I think that these things that we have in Europe, and that you have daycare, you have paid parental leave, you have less work time options, you have flexible work schedules, and health cares are something that all developed countries should have. And they help families tremendously in their ability to have children and to be scientists and to help for a better work-life balance. You can go to Europe and you can see the success rates of scientists there, and we pay taxes. We have all these things like daycare, and we're successful. We work less hours than Americans do, but we're still successful. So these things are important, in our opinion. And also there's societal norms. And one of the things we talk about, the equality of opportunities won't be achieved unless there's equality in society. And this is including in the home. If you went to the talk yesterday and it was showing different comics, there's always this thing where you're sitting at a meeting and someone says, oh, will you get coffee? And it's expected that a woman is the one that gets coffee. It happens at workplaces. It happens at home, where women are often the primary parent that takes care of the children, but they also have all their other jobs as well within the household, and including their job at work. So I want to end with what my colleague says, Sebastian Slobeck from the University of Uppsala. He said, there's need for more equal opportunities for men at home so that women can have more equal opportunities at work. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to hand off the MC duties to my colleague, Greg Jenkins.
Good morning. The next talk is by Alison Matthijs, Understanding the Impact of Personal Identities on Productivity in the Geosciences, Lessons from Research on Gender and Sexual Diversity in STEM.
Oops.
Okay, while my slides are getting set up, I just want to thank my previous panelists, because I think they will save me some time in having to tell you all about statistics that we all know about the lack of representation in the geosciences. So my name's Alison Matthijs. I use pronouns she, her. I'm an associate professor. This is my tenure haircut. I'm like an associate professor for 5 minutes. And I am an education researcher who's really fortunate to be part of the Advanced Geo team, which is led by the amazing Erica Marin-Spioda, who's here on the panel. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about some research that I've been a part of for the last few years, looking specifically at gender and sexual diversity in the STEM fields, with a little bit of specifics for geosciences. And and I'll give my collaborator, Jeremy Yoder, credit for this beautiful image here that he made. So I'm going to start just with a quick overview of intersectionality, which is a word that has suddenly become fairly popular in STEM, and AWIS even used it as their theme last year. So I want to emphasize that intersectionality is not about multiple identities. So we all have multiple identities, that is true, but structural stratification does not treat everyone the same based on their different identities. The problems that we're facing with diversity and inclusion and representation in all fields are not about individuals. They're about structures that disadvantage certain groups of people more than others. I also want to point out that intersectionality is a theory that comes from Black womanist thought, critical legal scholarship, and I think it's really important that all of us interested in these topics think about how a lot of the knowledge that we are applying comes from histories of struggle. And just because people are small in number, often those people that are most vulnerable have the most to teach us about what we should change. They're also doing a lot more work than a lot of the others of us that are in privileged positions. So when we're thinking about how do we change things, it is important for us to think about implicit biases and unconscious bias, absolutely. But that is just a step in coming to be aware of these structures. It doesn't change it. So it's important to also remember that we all have these internalized biases, and I think one of the previous presentations really made that point, and Janet's talk about why even women who make it to senior positions don't always support women in junior positions because they've had to exist in a very sexist structure. So in our study, I work with an evolutionary biologist, a geophysicist, a mechanical engineer, and an organic chemist. So I'm the social scientist who hangs out with these queer scientists who wanted to learn about talking to people. So that's my job. I'm like, let me tell you about IRB training and writing questions that humans can answer. But I have learned a lot from working with them because I am trained in very different epistemological frameworks that see social identities in a very different way than people who are trained in more scientific, hard sciences. A lot of the queer scientists we talk to are like, I want to know how many of us exist. That's personally not a question that I usually care that much about. I'm like, if there's one person in the room who's not being treated well, we should address that person and their humanity. But scientists want to know the numbers. So that's important. So we're using a mixed methods approach because we want to provide some numbers, but we're interested in more than just how many queer scientists exist. It's what are their experiences like. So the theoretical framework that guides our work is something we're loosely calling a transdisciplinary queer mixed methods research approach. And the benefit of this is to think about how can we draw on different areas of knowledge and inquiry approaches so that we can expand our methodological understandings beyond just the statistical correlation of what's your experience based on your identity, and also beyond my interests in ethnography and narrative inquiry. We also are drawing from queer theory, which rejects dichotomous categories of identity and affiliation. This is an especially difficult thing to do with survey research because it forces people into boxes. Surveys are very blunt instruments to get at sensitive information, but they're also really important, so I'm going to put a plug in for the Advanced Geo survey that all members of AGU are going to receive in the next year and ask you to please answer our survey. We're also trying to deliberately use different modes of data collection and analysis, and we are adopting critical approaches that have transformational goals. This is also something really different than a lot of hard scientists have been trained to do. So there's this idea that if you have a goal with the outcome of your research, then you're inherently biased. Well, yes, because you're a human, you are inherently biased. That's where we're coming from as social scientists. And this week especially, I've talked to lots of geoscientists about this idea of politics and what are gender politics and what are racial politics. And I have a PhD in educational policy, and my understanding of politics is that it is a generalized struggle to have your resources distributed according to values. That is what people do when they give grant funding, when they give publication space to certain articles, when they give awards. So scientists are always involved in politics, whether they like it or not. Sorry. So here's a brief overview of our data collection. So we call this Queer in STEM 1.0 and Queer in STEM 2.0. And this is just I'm not going to spend too long on this slide, but just to give you an idea of how we've adapted the strategy of data collection over the years. And also I want to reinforce that this is really a grassroots effort from a bunch of us who have other day jobs, and it really has been more of a side passion project. We don't have external funding. I think that's actually been really important in our response rate, and what I really want to point out on this slide is the high rate of respondents who identify as trans or gender nonconforming or non-binary. Our sample is much larger than a lot of other research, even on queer identities. And that's really important. So I don't really care about representation of these data. I care about the stories that are documented here and what we can learn from them. So again, I will give Jeremy credit for these lovely rainbow graphics. And so this is a quick overview of participant identities in terms of gender and sexuality from the 1.0 survey. And the main thing to see is that these don't add up to a total whole number because people could select more than one category, and lots of people do. So in our design, we did not force people into a category. They could pick all terms that applied to them or fill in other. So these are participant identities from 1.0, which only asked people that identified on the LGBTQIA continuum to respond. But in 2.0, we also asked people who identified as cis and straight to answer the survey because there was a call from a lot of people to have some comparison data. And this was something as a team that we kind of had to work through, because my approach was, okay, but do we really need to do that? But all of the scientists on my team outvoted me and said, no, we want to know. And I do see the value in that. If you have two people working in the same workplace, it's very useful to have some data that can be used to tell them, look, you're seeing the same thing in a really different way than someone sitting across the table from you. So maybe this can lead to some change. So our forthcoming piece has been a 4-year analysis of some qualitative data that I have, so this is forthcoming, hopefully early next year, and this is with my colleague Daniel Cruz Ramirez de Arellano. He's an organic chemist who also was trained in qualitative research methods, so he's like a unicorn, and he analyzed these data with me for the last 4 years. So what we've come up with is what we're calling a theory of queer STEM identity in the workplace that basically says people that identify as queer in STEM have these 3 aspects of what they're doing with their experience. So they're defining their identity as a queer individual, and there are a lot of things that impact how that feels on an individual level. Are you also a racial and ethnic minority? Did you grow up in a very religious community? And do you live in a state or a country where there are good protections for queer folks or where it might be hostile? Then we have forming a STEM identity, and this is really about people telling us, I always loved math. I always wanted to build things. This is why I became an engineer. But then people having undergraduate experiences, I think Corey's talk about REUs, that came out very strongly in our data, that having undergrad experiences is really important. And then professional training. A lot of folks talked about being an undergrad and having a really inspirational professor who convinced them that I could do more than just get my bachelor's degree in this. I could make a career as a scientist. And then all of those things impact how you navigate your workplace once you become a STEM professional. And we had about 2/3 of our respondents are in academia, but we definitely have representation in industry as well. And then we have professional organizations like AGU, where we are now, and how does that organization address or not issues of diversity? And a lot of scientific organizations have only very recently even had things like diversity panels or committees that are addressing issues of representation. So I have a few slides that just include some quotations from our participants, because the real goal of this work is to tell other people's stories, and hopefully you have something to learn from listening to them. So one thing to emphasize is that, yes, people care about having their queer identities acknowledged as existing in the workplace, but they all identified as scientists first. So this person said, we have to be flexible, able to do both field work and office work, not be afraid to get dirty, detail-oriented, able to deal with changing conditions, be good communicators, technically proficient, problem solvers. I like to work with people who are open communicators, curious and excited to learn new skills, and willing to use their own hands and brains to fix problems. These are the things people told us when we asked, why are you in your field? What makes you excited about science? But people do face challenges because there's often just not explicit acknowledgement that diversity is a thing and that people are not just sciences. So this person said, I feel that my LGBTQ identity limits my professional life in STEM, particularly the field that I work in, which often involves lots of time at rural or remote field stations. There are many jobs that I feel like I would take if I were straight and didn't have to worry about finding a community I could identify with. So I'm going to end so I stay on time and hopefully we have time for questions. But a few takeaways that I have is one, to just remember that if you are telling people you know their identity exists, they are going to have a little bit of their own psychological labor reduced when they come to work. So it's not that everyone wants to go to work and talk about their personal life. I know that a lot of scientists do not like that. However, the assumption that work is impersonal has disproportionate effects on people whose identities fall outside what is assumed to be the norm. So that compartmentalization that a lot of scientists engage in causes extra work for folks that are worried about whether their advisor is a secret homophobe. So just having some subtle way of telling people, you know, whatever it is that you're bringing to the table, I'm cool with that. It makes a difference. So it doesn't have to be a lot of big things. Also, most of our respondents reported never having had an out mentor in their field. I think this also really relates to a lot of the data we have about underrepresentation of women, underrepresentation of people of color. In the meantime, before we get to the drastic social change that we need, all of us have to learn to work across our differences and be mentors to people who aren't just like us, and make sure that an explicit goal we have is to make space for people that are not just like us in our fields. And we have to attend to intersectionality and bust all the isms and the binaries.
Okay, our next speaker is Chris Atkinson. Accessible, inclusive, innovative, the future of geosciences, of the geosciences workforce.
Good morning. Allison, I like your haircut. Congratulations on tenure. I wish I could get a haircut like that. So I'm going to try and give you about 21 years of history in about 5 to 10 minutes here, which will be tough. But also what I want to do is I want to talk about some kind of seminal papers from 1997 up and what we have done at the IEGD to both learn from that historical perspective and how we're trying to build on that for the future of the workforce development. I want to start off by showing you a picture here. This is actually the very first selfie on Mars. If you haven't seen this, this is Mars Insight. What's that? Okay, well, this is the first selfie of Insight. Thank you for the correction. But that wasn't really my point. My point actually is the fact that Insight is doing a lot of geological exploration on Mars. And I just want to ask, and perhaps it's rhetorical, how many geologists are actually stepping foot on the site to do this geological research? You don't have to answer. If you need an answer, I can see you after the talk. But also, I want to point out that this is a lander and not a rover, which means Insight has a mobility disability, but that doesn't stop the entire world from being excited about the science that it's actually doing, all right? So yesterday at the sexual harassment plenary, Robin Bell talked about the fact that we do better science when diverse voices are all at the table. And so what amazes me constantly is that whenever we show data of diversity, we rarely, if ever, see disability data included in diversity. And disability transcends all of diversity. And a big part of that problem is that it's quite protected data, and a lot of times it's very self-identified data. And so we need to figure out a way that we can make this more wide known or available, or if we don't know what the problem is, how are we trying to solve it? How are we going to solve this problem? And you would be quite surprised to know that there's a lot more disability out there than what you can actually see. So diversity is not the issue here. The access, the inclusion, equity, social justice, and opportunity, these are all the issues that we're dealing with. Diversity is there. These things are not. So I ask you, are the geosciences representative of our U.S. population? Disability is the third largest market segment in the U.S. One out of every 5 Americans have a disability of some kind. 1 in every 3 American households surveyed by Nielsen has a member, at least one member, identified with a disability, and more than 1 billion individuals on the planet have a disability of some kind. So what I want you to take away from this morning is that full participation requires opportunities for people to collaborate, to communicate, to collect data, to make interpretations, to integrate with to have technology integrated, to be able to problem solve. A lot of the examples I'm going to talk to you about today, we've been able to do all of these, and the key point here is that collaborative effort, that communication. Understand too, and I say this a lot, full participation does not mean 100% physical access to all the activities. And this is where the social piece of our science is coming in, and it's so very necessary for what it is we do. Having everybody engaged in the science doesn't mean you have to be physically present to be able to do that. So Michelle Cook and colleagues in 1997, one of the very first papers that we look at from the historical perspective is they focused on, and the big takeaway here is that by redesigning field experiences results in better learning for all students, okay? And understand that what I'm talking to you about today is field focused predominantly, which I also understand is very exclusive for parts of diversity who might not be interested or might not feel safe in the field. I understand that. That happens to be the point of what we're talking about today. And I'm always welcome to have discussions about other aspects of the geosciences so we can expand. One of the examples that I want to share with you was a trip that we took. It was a part of our Geopaths project a couple of years ago. This was in Arizona at the top of one of the volcanoes and outside of Flagstaff. And we have students, obviously, that cannot make it to the top. And so we utilize technology to be able to communicate and connect everyone to the science that we are actually doing. This actually worked out quite well. And the other point that I want to make here is that being able to do this science for everyone, even the students who were at the top of the volcano, it made them appreciate the science differently. It made them look for specific things in their observations and the information they were gathering to be able to share with their colleagues. It made their observations and interpretations so much stronger. This was a shot from one of those students from the top of the volcano looking down at an ancient lava flow. And they had access to real-time communication, not just the video and images. Another example, this was in Western Ireland a year later, where students were utilizing the technology to not only take their measurements, but also to record that collection of measurements to be able to share with their colleagues who were at another field site doing things that they had access to be able to do, and they were sharing with their colleagues that were at the inaccessible field sites. So they were taking all this information and they were making the interpretation of the entire field site together, not just one versus the other. In 2002, Mick Hall and colleagues came up with the fact that even if we have a similar type of disability, that those disability types are often going to require different approaches for inclusion as well. And so we realized this, and that the different ways in which we do things, even for a same disability type, for this instance, a mobility disability looks very, very different. and can require a lot of different techniques for that accessibility and that inclusion. Unfortunately, I've learned this the hard way through some of the projects I've done. Everything that I know, I've learned from what other people can tell me, and then we try something, and if it crashes and burns, then we try something else. But it's constantly trying new things. So understanding that if you think that just because it's a paved or a flat surface that it's going to be accessible, it's not always the case. Sharon Locke, 2005, came out that said that we need to think beyond the typical major, this historical perspective, this traditional ableist perspective of a major in today's classroom. And so this is a group of students that I had a combined class that was focused on learning how to accommodate students with disabilities in the classroom. And so if we're trying to learn how to accommodate them for pre-service teachers, why are we not including those students in our classrooms? And so we developed a combined class with a residential program at the University of Cincinnati where these students were actually a part of the classroom, and the students with disabilities were doing the teaching. And they were talking about what it is they can do and what they need help with. And this was a very, very successful project. Allison Stokes, Trevor Collins, and colleagues they told us that we need to think beyond our own boundaries and our own experiences. And a lot of us are field focused. Very, very many of us have had those field experiences coming up through. And so Tuesday, Eleanor Snow talked about the Step Up program at the USGS and working with autistic students and getting them engaged in scientific research. So this was an opportunity, this was one of those pivotal moments in a career where you get asked to come along on a trip. This was actually the Citizen Science GIS program in Belize. And they had accepted a student, an undergraduate geography student who was autistic. And they had asked me to come along and work with him and kind of do some troubleshooting and planning and all those kinds of things. Now this was an international REU program in a very remote location. He was responsible for learning how to fly drones and do mapping of islands on the Barrier Reef, which is a pretty cool REU, actually. So I didn't turn that down. But this is an example, right? So you automatically assume, or people make assumptions for someone's abilities and the things that they can and cannot do. This is an example of the student who has a social disability working with children at the local library and telling them about the science that he's actually doing. And this was a great picture of him on the right, learning how to fly the drone for the first time, which he was completely ecstatic about. And then the bigger picture is him on one of the islands doing the mapping. So the point here is we need to think beyond what we assume to be accessible and inclusive, and put yourself out there and be uncomfortable and learn from the students that you're actually trying to support. And then Julie Sexton talked about the marketing materials that we're throwing out there on websites and how we're actually excluding through the way that we're presenting our own sciences. This was a project, a 2-year project, that we looked at perceptions of geoscientists and how the continued marginalization of geoscientists with disabilities is actually perpetuating this cycle of it's non-inclusive. So there's a point here, I'm going to kind of skip over this one, but there's a point where we need to look at the discipline itself and the workforce and what the barriers are for why we're not able to do this. So what have we learned? Traditional methods often marginalize those who do not fit this cultural normative identity. And that cultural normative identity, the Geosciences has this culture, right? It's a very rugged culture. It's a very heteronormative culture. It's a very masculine culture. And we're dealing with this. And until we deal with that we're always going to be fighting that barrier. The issue of disability is much larger and more widespread than we realize. And a lot of this is because people assume if they can't see the disability, it doesn't exist. And a lot of our students, and it kind of goes in to the other points here, that safeguards that protect identity which is often why we don't have the data, redirects bias and stereotype onto those who do disclose disabilities. So if you have a student who chooses to disclose a disability that's not apparent, whether it's a chronic illness, whether it's you name it, right? It's not a disability that's obvious, and so they take the backlash for that, and people automatically distrust that the student or the individual is trying to say something or do something to get out of doing something. Inclusively designed opportunities that support all students. So we do realize that when we design these to support all students, that we're supporting all students. So it's time to move beyond awareness and make something happen. I did a really quick search for what NSF has in education and human resources, or human resources, the amount of projects that have existed. What's happening here is that we have a difference between awareness and action. Awareness is when a proposal comes in and that proposal says, yes, we're doing something for this, and oh yeah, a student with a disability could participate in this as well. Action is that it's specifically designed for a student with disability. And these are all projects, and we can talk about those more later. We've seen this, this chart by Heather Holton, talks about all the different aspects of the geosciences, and that I want you to look at this chart and I want you to tell me how many of these disciplines require a field-based learning component that require you to physically be in the field. So we need to think about this. We need to think about expect community-wide implementation, support collaborative efforts across all of STEM, supporting students and training faculty. We need to look at this transition to degree, what it is that we're allowing or enabling our students to be able to do in the degree programs, and then transition to career. What do we need to do to be able to support these students as they make that transition into career and supporting them in the workforce? And then develop and retain them within the workforce, so supporting employees and training employers. The American Association for People with Disabilities, they put this out. They surveyed 45 Fortune 1000 companies and focused on disability employment and inclusion. And they come up that those companies that do support disability employment and inclusion have higher revenue, have higher net income, better performance and profit margins. A couple of good papers that you might want to look at. Why is diversity vital for innovation? Study finds diversity boosts innovation in U.S. companies. The research is coming out. It's talking about this. Supporting the diverse perspectives makes science innovative and new. If you're around today at 1 o'clock, I just wanted to do this quick plug. The Iger Award we're going to present at the booth at 1 o'clock. These are our supporters, and let us know how we can help. Thank you.
Okay, our last talk before the panel session is by Linda Gunderson, Ethics, Integrity, and Diversity in the Research Environment, Connections to a Pathway Forward.
Wow, what awesome talks this morning. So in the spirit of diversity, you're going to hear about diversity and inclusion from the integrity and ethics perspective. And I'm going to start with some fundamentals about the ideas I'm trying to get across. Excellence in the geosciences relies on who we are, our experiences, how we behave by ourselves and with others, in our interests and our goals. It relies on our values, no matter who we are. And our values affect our implicit and explicit biases. By understanding our biases and conscientiously fostering an ethical culture of diversity and inclusion and scientific integrity, we're going to really advance the geosciences and have excellence in our science. So those are my basic premises I'm going to be talking about. So a little bit on values. We attach values to everything. When we choose a project, choose a collaborator, collect a sample, we make decisions based upon values we have, some of which we may not even be aware of. They can be scientific integrity values, like the 6 core values put forth by the National Academy of Sciences in 2017. Honesty, objectivity, fairness, openness, accountability, and stewardship. They could be geoethical values, like I want my work to be on resource sustainability or green energy or climate change mitigation. Or they can be personal values. I want to advance my career. I want to beat the competition. I want to get that next grant. I'm going to date that person. I'm going to prove my point. I'm going to make myself look good. And this valuation changes the way we do our science. In 2014, Scientific American put out a great volume on diversity and inclusion and how it affects science. And here's some results from one of the papers that talked about gender and cultural influence that affected research on a very fundamental level. In primate research, the example that they gave, early on in the field, it was dominated by male scientists, and they focused on male primate competition for females. And then slowly but surely, more women came into the field, and they looked at reproductive strategies. Typically, US scientists have focused on male dominance and group dynamics. Japanese scientists, who have some very particular kinds of primates, focused on status and societal structure over time. Very different perspectives brought new science to the problem. And it's too bad we couldn't have all been working on it together at the same time. Another example I'd like to give is the history of women in clinical trials. Not many of you may know that prior to the 1990s, it was white male dominated. That's what all of the data was based upon. There were policies in the 1980s to try and improve that, but they were largely ignored, and there's reports that talked about how they were ignored. From the 1990s to the 2000s, there were a lot stronger laws and policy and grants that caused more inclusion of women and minorities. And from 2000 to present, even though we have more regulations, studies, and guidelines, and there is continued improvement, fundamentally, there's significant diseases like Alzheimer's where there's insufficient data on women and minorities. And another value concern I have in the sciences is when I look at data about why scientists engage in misconduct. And this is from Dubois et al., who, him and his authors deal with researchers who are in rehab, who did misconduct and who are trying to change themselves to go back and be back in science. But the number one reason they committed misconduct was lack of attention. They were overextended, they were distracted, they weren't detailed-oriented. And that's followed by they were unsure of the rules, there was a lack of mentoring or cultural differences, they didn't prioritize compliance, they had relationship problems, their staff lacked adequate training or integrity, there wasn't a culture of compliance, there was poor communication, and finally, ambition. And so when our values and priorities are out of balance and we focus on research funding and competition and less on inclusion, diversity, science integrity, and having that flourishing research environment we'd all like to have, we lose. Because being inclusive gives research groups the competitive edge. Diversity positively, absolutely, directly affects scientific outcomes. There's decades of research on it in many different fields that show that diverse groups are more innovative and creative. Diverse groups undertake more comprehensive analyses. And, you know, when compared, diverse groups, when compared with high ability problem solvers that were homogeneous, they beat them out. So it's something that big companies like Google and Amazon and others really see. And if you go up and look at Microsoft's or any other big business's thing, diversity and inclusionary environments that's their business proposition. That's what they're going for. So why aren't we more diverse? Well, we've been hearing about it all throughout this meeting. There are socioeconomic walls and cultural customs and value differences and individual decisions that we make. But we have implicit and explicit bias and hostile and isolating work environments. We are doing well with our pipeline approach. You heard lots of talks, hopefully this week, about increasing numbers in the pipeline and great targeted programs and outreach, bridging programs, specialty grants, especially mentoring too. But I really want to emphasize this retention approach and changing our environments, increasing support of folks through mentoring, civility intervention, behavioral training, family flexible policies, specialty grants and inclusion, diversity and strong policy and practices. And I'm a policy person. But we have found, and one of the great talks that was given this week was that instructor empathy and classroom environment play a large role in the retention of underrepresented students. And the retention numbers for our underrepresented students in the Geosciences are just terrible. And it's something that we really need to address. We're starting to change the norms in our research environments, but we're in a watershed moment. Our actions now are going to have a lasting effect on the future and excellence of the Geosciences. We're beginning to recognize the impact on scientists of detrimental behaviors like harassment and discrimination and hostile and isolating research environments. And so much so that I was on the committee for the National Academy of Sciences that looked at sexual harassment in the sciences. And one of our principal findings was that sexual harassment is as important as plagiarism, falsification, and fabrication. We're now trying to change scientific integrity and ethics codes and back them up with action. And with AGU and AAS leading the way, we're seeing more and more professional societies. But we need more tools and research on assessing and changing the research environment. Advanced Geo is one of these, and I just think it's such a great thing. And if you haven't looked at it yet, they're coming out with more and more tools and guidance, and it's terrific. One of the things that I get great promise out of is some of the new codes of ethics that I'm seeing. I'm going to just take 1 second to sip this. Last year at the World Economic Forum, they brought together 40 scientists from all over the globe, and they asked them to produce a code of ethics. And what a code of ethics they produced. They want to engage with the public. They want to pursue the truth. They want to minimize harm. They want to engage with decision makers. But boy, they want to support diversity, and they want mentors. They want mentors to be available, guiding, trusting, and empowering. So there are two broad areas all of us can personally work on: our values and our behavior. Doing this will directly affect our science. In short, we need to care. We need to care about the faculty next door, the person next to us in the lab, our students, our coworkers, our peers, and care about the scientific enterprise. In the field, classroom, or laboratory, we need to create a diverse and inclusive and open speak-up environment. Ensure all are heard, and acknowledge each person's contribution. This maximizes their desire to reach their full potential. It's a catalyst. Encouraging diversity rather than conformity also incites that creative thinking. And we know the consequences This is also from the National Academy of Science study. Discriminating and harassing environments damage productivity and the science. They affect our health, they produce fear and hostile work environments, people lose jobs. Those negative effects can extend across an organization. There's costly loss of talent, it impacts recruitment and retention, it represses an entire portion of the workforce, and it replicates unethical and very costly practices. Some best practices to try and deploy in your institutions and for yourself is to recognize and reduce those cultural norms that support discrimination and harassment, both personally and in our environments. To value people who support and lead in inclusion and diversity and mentoring through promotions, through performance evaluations, and through rewards. And to support diversity and inclusion in policies, practices, processes, and your everyday behavior. It's not a check-the-box responsibility. It's a business decision, a cultural decision, a personal decision. It's an ethical decision, and it's a good science decision. And scientists have to meet this challenge with sincerity, openness, honesty, and be responsive. So my last slide. 4 things we need to do for real. You've seen a lot of this, but we really need to do this. We really need to take personal responsibility to model what scientific integrity, ethical practice, and inclusion look like, how they're connected, and make sure that they're core values. We have to have open, honest dialogue on where the climate of the geosciences is with regard to these, and use best practices and community-based ways to tackle these issues. And finally, we really need to train and equip scientists to create inclusive, respectful, diverse research environments, and to dedicate people time and funds. Thanks.
Great, so now we're going to open it up for questions, and we have about 12 minutes, and we'll open it up to the public, and you can ask any of the panelists. Maybe we don't have enough chairs for all of you, but yeah.
You talked about differences in perception of minorities when you're at different percentages of the group.
Yeah.
But what about minorities, like, for example, this population at large are only 50%, so they're never going to be more than 50% of the scientific group. How do we make sure that they don't always remain tokenized if they don't ever go above 50%?
Thanks, it's a great question. So there is some evidence that tokenism can be moderated by culture and an environment. So a study by Catherine Turco that came out about a couple of years ago in 2016 looked at how in a certain context the African Americans in the community were not tokenized, but the women in the community were. But it had to do with certain kinds of cultural norms associated with the performance of tasks. So that would indicate that there may be some cultural ways to get around some of that. The other issue is that there's certain minorities that will always be in a minority position with respect to the group. The tricky thing is recognizing the tokenist dynamics and when they exist and when they're happening. And that's why having those moments of, oh, they're only here because they're a woman is very helpful, or they're only here because they're disabled is helpful as a reminder that there's actually something bigger going on. Mm-hmm. And so in certain cases, if you can just take that moment to step back and say, oh, actually, we should expect this dynamic here, so what are we going to do to get around that, or what are we going to do to counter that as a narrative, may actually be the most important way forward in situations where the group is always going to be at 15 or between 15 and 30. Mm-hmm. I think good question.
I have a question for Claudia about implicit bias training for panels, and I'm just wondering if you have any data about the efficacy of that, because I think it's a really critically important part, but we want to be sure that what we're doing is actually effective in the panel decision.
So I'm just going to repeat the question real quick so people in the back can hear it, because we don't have a microphone. So the question is about data on efficacy of training on implicit bias for funding panels.
So what we've done, we have not trained the panel itself. What we've trained was the program officers that sit in every single panel meeting. So we know that some of our panel members have been trained at their host institutions, and we decided that because there is there is a high pressure on their time availability to be trained when they come to our panel meetings, what we decided was that we would start by training the program officers that are sitting in every single panel meeting so that they felt empowered and able to identify where there was potential unconscious bias and speak up. So we started with this approach. We are showing a video, but that's a 7-minute video. So what we noticed was that, of course, it's not going to be a revolution, but it started a lot of discussions in the panel. After they'd seen the video, when they came in and they sat around the table, we usually have committees between 14 and 18 panel members. When they came down and they sat, there was some discussion. So there was a kind of I wouldn't say a wow moment, but there was a start of something, which we found very useful. The chairs, they are trained, and now we're moving also to train our governing body, our scientific council.
Other questions? So you can ask a question of one of the panelists or just a general question for any of them. So the question, I'm just repeating so everybody can hear. The question was about, we've heard a lot about conversation about the value of diversity for science, and how do we balance that with thinking about the experience or value of different individuals? Is that? Okay.
So can you define what you mean by the value of the individual?
Yeah, so not just wanting diversity where the end goal is doing science, but thinking about access for people to do science.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right. I guess a quick answer that I would have, and I think this really gets at Chris's work, but I think it's that you can't have the benefit of diverse working groups if you're not acknowledging individuals. So I don't know if I'm interpreting your question accurately, but in order to have that benefit, it can't be the tokenizing that Janet's talking about. It can't just be like, I checked all the boxes, so my lab looks like my understanding of representation of the general population or something. It has to be, I've gotten to the point where I am able to allow everyone in my group to bring what they have to the table and know that I can't know what that is until I've gotten to know them. So making a space for people's differences to be valued and making sure that their voices are heard so that these dominant cultural norms that folks have talked about don't sort of homogenize everyone.
So that's an excellent response. I don't have anything really to add to that other than the fact that it's the individuals, it's this group of individuals that is pushing the science forward. Everybody just doesn't blend in. In the work that I do, it's focusing on the individual is what is expanding the knowledge base that everybody else is gaining from this. It's actually making the work that we do and the science that we do so much stronger because of individual perspectives. So the individuals are certainly not being the individual abilities and perspectives and talents aren't being overlooked here. That's the foundation of the work that diversity brings.
Can I add something? Yeah. I basically agree with the previous responses. I just would like to add that I think the tricky issue when we try to maximize diversity is that we have also to preserve the excellence of individuals. So excellence of individuals is our main criteria as a scientific association. I'm talking for EGU, for the European Geosciences Union. And the tricky issue is that sometimes excellence comes from a previous advantage that certain categories benefited from. And so this is, I think, the key point, how to preserve excellence while recognizing that for some categories, reaching excellence is much more difficult. So from an operational point of view, to my view, this is really very challenging because on the one hand, we don't want to introduce any positive bias with respect to any category. On the other hand, the question is what kind of action should be adopted to remove the hurdles that prevent some category of peoples to reach excellence. And, you know, this is a tough discussion. Sometimes you have to work with, if you look at the geographical balance, for instance, sometimes you have to work at the country level. You have to work with the national institutions. And sometimes you have to work at the continental level. And I find that this is really the key issue. I'm not sure if I contributed to replying to your question, but I think this is really the key point. And I don't have an answer for that.
I have the privilege of being the moderator, so I'll jump in, and because I have the microphone in front of me, and then I'll go to the next question. I think we can also, I get your point that we shouldn't want diverse people from different backgrounds in the room because it makes our science better, but because they should be able to access, right, being in the room and doing what they want to do, even if it doesn't make our science better. So I appreciate your point. And I also, I think this whole conversation about excellence makes me a little uncomfortable because I think we need to interrogate how we define excellence. But anyway, I'll get off my high horse and I'll let Greg ask the next question.
I have two quick questions. One is to the EGU folks. How do you define diversity, and do you include immigrants and folks from North Africa, or, I mean, is there any push on that? And then at the larger public universities, there's a sense of comfort around having one or two. We'll never get to 15 or 30% because deans and chairs, et cetera, feel comfortable with, we've reached our number already.
So I'll just rephrase the question real quick is about at EGU, how do they define diversity? Is it just gender, or do they include other like immigrant status, et cetera? And also, you know, in many institutions, you know, deans and higher up will get comfortable at levels that are much lower below those numbers that we know reduce exclusion and tokenism.
Yeah, first of all, it's really a big issue. And we started in a very simple way by trying to identify metrics. And the very simple statistics that we started with is just look at the awardees and their country of affiliation. So we gained some statistics on that, and it's a simple statistics, but still it's concerning because there is a dominance of awardees with affiliation in the Western world. We would like also to elaborate some metrics because we want to work with numbers, because we want to work with facts that look at the issues that you mentioned, but we are still discussing on it. It's really challenging. I think, for instance, a previous status of migrants, it's something that we need to consider. And also we are considering to look at ethnics and to look at country of origin, not only country of affiliation, which is a little bit more complicated because, you know, when you ask information from people, when you collect information from people, also there are privacy issues. And in Europe, we had a recent new regulation regarding privacy that is very strict. So we are trying to move forward in this way, and it's an open question still. And but we can clearly perceive, if you look at the community in Europe, in EGU, but also in AGU, you can clearly perceive that there is a problem of geographical balance, which is, I think, something that we don't have to underrule. It's really important.
All right, any final questions? We're getting to the end of our hour. I want to thank again all of our invited presenters. I think this was a really rich set of conversations about how to think about diversity and inclusion in the geosciences, some of the real opportunities that we are just beginning to discover and take advantage of. So help me thank our speakers again. I also wanted to put in a pitch, if you have nothing else going on in the next hour or so, or you may already be planning to do this, there is right now a session called Bright Stars, which is an education poster session. These are pre-college, middle school, high school, and sometimes even elementary school kids participating in after-school or summer research experiences related to the geosciences. They are here presenting their data and results. It's a really engaging opportunity to see the future of our community. So I hope you'll stop by. Thank you.